The night was dark, and the rain fell relentlessly, drumming against the glass windows of the towering corporate building. Inside, the long hallways echoed with the faint sound of a mop dragging across the marble floor. David, a middle-aged janitor with weary eyes and calloused hands, worked the night shift as he always did, unnoticed and unappreciated. His uniform was faded, his shoes soaked from an earlier leak in the storage room, but he pushed through his exhaustion. It was just another shift, another paycheck, another night where no one acknowledged his presence. As he wrung out the mop and prepared to finish his work, he heard an unusual noise coming from the parking lot. At first, he dismissed it, assuming it was just the storm. But then he heard it again, a muffled groan, followed by the sound of someone collapsing. His heart pounded as he hesitated near the exit door, uncertain whether to investigate or mind. His own business, curiosity and concern warred inside him. What if someone is in trouble, he thought. He stepped outside cautiously, his breath visible in the cold night air, and looked around the nearly empty lot. Near a sleek black limousine parked under a dim street lamp, a man lay sprawled on the ground, motionless. David rushed forward, squinting through the rain to get a better look. As he got closer, his eyes widened in recognition. It was Richard Sterling, the billionaire CEO of the company. David had seen him many times, though never up close. Sterling was the kind of man who walked past janitors without a glance, whose mere presence made employees nervous. He was powerful, untouchable. Until now, David knelt beside the man, his hands trembling. Richard's face was pale, his breathing ragged. His expensive suit was soaked from the rain, his phone lying inches away, its screen shattered. "Mr. Sterling, can you hear me?" David shook him gently, but there was no response. Panic rose in his chest. He looked around desperately, but the parking lot was deserted. No security guards, no drivers, no one. David's fingers fumbled for his phone as he dialed 911. His voice was urgent as he explained the situation, his pulse racing with adrenaline. "I think he's having a heart attack," he told the dispatcher, following their instructions to check for a pulse. It was faint, too faint. The minutes stretched painfully long as David performed CPR, counting under his breath, pressing against the millionaire's chest with all his strength. The rain continued to pour, drenching them both, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Flashing red and blue lights cut through the night as an ambulance screeched to a halt. Paramedics rushed out, taking over as David stumbled back, his legs weak. He watched as they worked on Sterling, their expressions tense. One of them turned to him. "If you hadn't started CPR when you did, he might not have made it." The words stunned him. As they loaded Richard into the ambulance, David stood frozen, watching as the doors slammed shut. He was just a janitor, an invisible worker. No one noticed. Yet tonight, he had just saved a billionaire's life. He took a deep breath, his heart still pounding. Little did he know, this night would change both of their lives forever. The ambulance sped through the city streets, its siren wailing, as the rain continued to pour. Inside, paramedics worked frantically to stabilize Richard Sterling. His breathing was shallow, his pulse weak, and his face drained of color. David sat in the corner of the ambulance, drenched and shivering, watching with anxious eyes. He had no idea why he had been allowed to ride along. Maybe because he was the only witness, or maybe because he had been the one to save the billionaire's life. Either way, he felt out of place, surrounded by medical professionals working swiftly with their monitors and oxygen masks. As they pulled into the emergency bay, the doors swung open, and the paramedics rushed Richard into the hospital. David hesitated, unsure whether to follow or leave. He had done his part, hadn't he? He could just slip away, return to his night shift, and pretend this had never happened. But something kept his feet planted where they were. Maybe it was the way the doctor's face had looked so grim. Maybe it was the realization that Richard had no family or friends waiting for him. David swallowed hard and took a deep breath before stepping inside. The emergency room was a whirlwind of motion, nurses running between beds, doctors shouting orders, the smell of antiseptic thick in the air. Richard was wheeled into a critical care room, disappearing behind swinging doors marked "No Entry, Authorized Personnel Only." David stood outside, unsure of what to do next. A nurse approached him, her expression kind but urgent. "Are you a relative?" she asked. David shook his head quickly. "No, just the guy who found him," she sighed, glancing toward the room. "He's in bad shape. Massive cardiac arrest. If you hadn't given him CPR, he wouldn't have made it here alive." The words hit David like a weight. He had saved a man's life, a man who likely didn't even know his name. As the hours passed, David remained in the waiting area, his mind restless. He should have left by now, but something held him back. His shift was long over, and he was exhausted. But the thought of leaving Sterling alone in that hospital bed made his chest feel heavy. Despite his wealth and status, the billionaire was just a vulnerable man now, lying helpless, with machines keeping him alive. A doctor finally emerged, rubbing his tired eyes as he scanned the room. "Is there a David here?" David stood abruptly. "That's me," the doctor nodded and motioned for him to follow. "I know you're not family, but you're the only one here." He's stable for now, but it was close. The next 24 hours are critical. David stepped inside the dimly lit hospital room. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor filled the air, and there lay Richard, unconscious, tubes running from his nose and IVs in his arms. The powerful businessman looked fragile, almost unrecognizable. For a moment, David hesitated. What was he even doing here? This was a man who had never noticed him before, who had likely walked past him dozens of times, without so much as a glance. Yet looking at him now, he didn't see a ruthless billionaire. He saw a man, a human being clinging to life. David sighed and pulled up a chair beside the bed. He wasn't sure why, but he stayed. He stayed as the night stretched into morning, as nurses came and went, as the city outside continued on with its life. Hours later, a soft groan broke the silence. David jolted awake, realizing he had dozed off. He turned to see Richard stirring, his eyelids fluttering open. The man blinked, his gaze unfocused, before settling on David. Confusion crossed his features. "Where am I?" Richard's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. David hesitated before answering. "You're in the hospital. You had a heart attack." Richard frowned, his eyes narrowing. He seemed to be trying to process the words. Then his gaze sharpened as he focused on David. "Who are you?" David exhaled slowly. "Just a janitor." For a moment, silence hung between them. Then Richard's expression shifted, suspicion creeping into his tired eyes. "Then what are you doing here?" David's jaw tightened. He had saved this man's life, spent hours waiting by his bedside, and now he was being questioned like some stranger with an ulterior motive. But he swallowed his frustration and simply said, "I was the one who found you. I called the ambulance." Richard stared at him, blinking slowly. "You saved me?" His voice was laced with disbelief. David nodded. "Yeah." Richard exhaled, looking away. "Why?" The question caught David off guard. It was the kind of question only someone like Richard Sterling would ask, as if kindness needed a reason. David shrugged. Because it was the right thing to do. Richard didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. For the first time in a long while, he felt something unfamiliar. Vulnerability. He had spent his whole life believing money made him invincible, that power made him untouchable. But tonight, he had been at the mercy of a janitor. As the silence stretched on, David stood up. "Look, I don't expect anything from you. I just wanted to make sure you were okay." He turned to leave, but before he reached the door, Richard's voice stopped him. "Wait." David glanced back. Richard hesitated, as if the words were foreign. To him. "Thank you." David nodded once before walking out of the room. Little did he know, this was just the beginning of a story that neither of them could have ever imagined. Richard Sterling was a man who had built his empire from the ground up. He was not born into wealth. He had clawed his way to the top, pushing past every obstacle with sheer determination and an iron will. But along the way, he had lost something. compassion, empathy, the ability to see people as anything other than stepping stones or inconveniences. His life was built on power, and in his world, power meant control. His mornings began with his personal assistant reading him the day's schedule as his chauffeur drove him through the city. Every minute of his day was meticulously planned. Board meetings, investment decisions, client dinners. There was no room for delays, no patience for anything that wasn't directly contributing to his wealth. The world moved around Richard Sterling, and he moved through it like a force of nature, leaving no time for pleasantries or kindness. At the corporate building where David worked as a janitor, Richard was a well-known figure, but not for the right reasons. He was feared. Employees whispered when he passed by, his presence commanding silence in any room he entered. No one dared to meet his eyes for too long. To him, janitors, security guards, receptionists, they were all invisible. If they weren't signing million-dollar contracts or making him richer, they simply did not exist in his world. One evening, months before the heart attack that changed everything, Richard had stormed through the lobby of his company, his expensive shoes clicking against the polished floor. His face was like thunder as he barked orders into his phone. "I don't care what it takes. Get it done. Fire them if you have to." His voice echoed through the halls, making employees shrink in their seats. David had been mopping near the elevator when Richard approached, too consumed by his phone call to notice him. As David stepped back to avoid getting in the way, his mop accidentally left a streak of water across the floor. Richard's foot slipped slightly, and he snapped his head up with fury. "Are you blind?" he spat, glaring at David. David, used to being ignored, was stunned by the direct attack. He quickly muttered an apology and moved aside, but Richard didn't wait for a response. He was already gone, striding toward the elevator, barking at his assistant. "Get someone competent to clean this place." That was Richard Sterling, ruthless, impatient, dismissive. He didn't see the exhaustion in David's eyes, didn't notice the way the janitor's hands were rough from years of hard work. People like David didn't matter to him. His arrogance wasn't limited to the workplace. At high-end parties, he surrounded himself with socialites and wealthy businessmen, exchanging fake smiles and empty promises over glasses of expensive champagne. He wore designer suits and drove the latest sports cars, ensuring that his presence was always associated with success. He measured people by their bank accounts, dismissing those who had nothing to offer him. Even in his personal life, Richard's wealth dictated everything. His relationships were shallow, transactional. He had been married once, but his wife had left him years ago, tired of living in a world where money meant more than love. He had no children, no family he cared about. His only concern was growing his empire, securing his legacy, and ensuring that no one could ever bring him down. And yet, despite all the power, despite the luxury and the success, Richard Sterling was alone. He never thought about it. He convinced himself that loneliness was the price of greatness. He didn't need anyone, but that belief shattered the night he collapsed in the parking lot, gasping for breath, and the only person who stopped to save him was a janitor he had never once acknowledged. As he lay in the hospital, his mind was foggy, but the pieces of his life were beginning to realign. He had built walls around himself, convinced that wealth was the only thing that mattered. But when he had been at his weakest, when he had been helpless and on the verge of death, his money had meant nothing. The only thing that had saved him was the kindness of someone he had treated as invisible. Richard's fingers twitched as he stared at the ceiling of his hospital room, the beeping machines surrounding him. For the first time in years, he felt something he didn't recognize, humility, and it terrified him. The hospital room was eerily silent except for the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. The fluorescent light above flickered slightly, casting a dim glow over the sterile white walls. Richard Sterling's eyelids fluttered, his breath uneven as he stirred from unconsciousness. His body felt heavy, as if it were sinking into the Hospital bed. A dull pain throbbed in his chest, and his throat was dry, each breath feeling like an effort. Slowly, he opened his eyes. The world around him was a blur, the ceiling swimming in and out of focus. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear his vision, but the brightness stung. His mind felt foggy, like he was caught between sleep and wakefulness. Where was he? The last thing he remembered was reaching for his car, feeling an unbearable pressure in his chest, and then darkness. His gaze shifted sluggishly around the room. The walls were unfamiliar, and the antiseptic smell in the air was unmistakable. A hospital. A tangle of tubes ran from his arms. An oxygen mask sat beside him, and the distant murmur of nurses in the hallway confirmed it. Panic flickered in his chest as he tried to move, but his limbs were weak. He swallowed hard, forcing his dry throat to produce sound. "Where am I?" His voice came out hoarse, barely a whisper. There was movement beside him. A figure stirred in the chair by the bed, sitting upright with a start. Richard's bleary vision sharpened just enough to make out a man in a faded uniform, his face lined with exhaustion. The man leaned forward slightly, his eyes watching Richard with cautious relief. "You're in the hospital," the man said, his voice steady but quiet. "You had a heart attack." Richard frowned, his mind sluggishly trying to process the words. A heart attack? That couldn't be right. He was only in his early 50s, wealthy, powerful, still in his prime. Heart attacks happen to weak men, old men, not to someone like him. Yet here he was, lying in a hospital bed, hooked up to machines that were keeping him alive. His eyes flickered back to the man beside him. Who was he? He wasn't a doctor, wasn't dressed like a nurse. There was something familiar about him, though Richard couldn't place it. His chest ached as he forced himself to speak again. "Who are you?" The man hesitated, as if considering whether to answer. Finally, he leaned back slightly and exhaled. "Just a janitor." Richard's frown deepened. A janitor. His mind was still hazy, but the pieces were slowly clicking into place. He had collapsed in the parking lot. That much he could remember. He had been alone, struggling to breathe, unable to call for help. But then, someone had been there. Someone had saved him. His eyes locked onto the janitor, and something in his expression must have given him away. "You saved me?" David nodded, his face unreadable. "Yeah." Richard didn't know what to say. Gratitude was an emotion he wasn't used to expressing. He had spent his life believing he was above ordinary people, that wealth separated him from the struggles of the common man. Yet, at his most vulnerable moment, it hadn't been his wealth, his business partners, or his high-powered connections that had saved him. It had been a janitor. A flicker of suspicion crossed Richard's mind, pushing aside the brief moment of humility. His lips pressed into a thin line as he studied David's face. Why? The question hung in the air between them. It wasn't asked with gratitude. It was laced with doubt, with the assumption that there must be an ulterior motive. People didn't just do things for free in Richard's world. David's jaw tightened slightly, but his expression remained calm. Because it was the right thing to do. Richard searched his face, waiting for some hint of dishonesty, some sign that this man wanted money or recognition. But there was nothing, just a simple, honest truth. The billionaire's mind whirled, trying to make sense of it all. He had always believed that power dictated the world, that people only acted when they had something to gain. And yet, this man, this janitor he had never noticed before, had saved him without expecting anything in return. It made no sense. Silence stretched between them. Richard turned his gaze back to the ceiling, feeling an unfamiliar weight settle over him. He had spent his life believing he didn't need anyone, that his wealth was his shield. But when it had mattered most, his money had been useless. For the first time in his life, Richard Sterling felt small. David shifted in his chair, checking the time. He had stayed longer than he had planned. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because he had wanted to make sure Richard woke up. Or maybe because some part of him needed to see if a man like Richard Sterling could feel gratitude. Either way, his job here was done. He stood, adjusting his uniform. "I should get going," he said, breaking the silence. Richard turned his head slightly, watching him. He hesitated, as if searching for the right words. But in the end, all he could manage was a gruff, barely audible, "Thank you." David gave a small nod, then walked out the door, leaving Richard alone with his thoughts. As the billionaire stared at the ceiling, a strange, unsettling thought crept into his mind. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure who he was anymore. The hospital room was quiet after David left, but Richard Sterling was anything but at peace. His mind was restless, replaying the events that led him here over and over again. He had always believed that money made him untouchable, that power was his greatest asset. Yet, when he had been gasping for air, teetering on the edge of death, none of it had mattered. No amount of wealth had saved him. A janitor had. He shifted slightly in bed, wincing at the ache in his chest. The doctor had warned him that stress and an unhealthy lifestyle had taken a toll on his heart. If he didn't change, he wouldn't be lucky a second time. But what did change, even? Richard had spent decades building his empire, perfecting the art of control. Was he supposed to suddenly care about people? That wasn't who he was. A soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. A nurse entered, checking his vitals with a gentle smile. "You're recovering well, Mr. Sterling. The doctor will be in soon." Richard barely acknowledged her. His mind was elsewhere. His hands subconsciously reached for his phone, a habit ingrained in him. But when he powered it on, there were no missed calls from family, no worried messages from friends. Just emails about deals and contracts waiting for his approval. He stared at the screen, a strange emptiness creeping in. Was this all his life really was? Hours passed, and Richard found himself watching the world outside his hospital window. The city moved on without him, people hurrying to work, taxis honking, lights flashing in the distance. He had spent his life believing he was above the ordinary, that he was different from the people who lived paycheck to paycheck, struggling to get by. But for the first time, he wondered if they had something he didn't. His thoughts drifted back to the janitor. David, a man who had no wealth, no status, and yet, when faced with a choice, had done something Richard wasn't sure he would have done himself. He had saved a man who never even acknowledged him. The next morning, a doctor walked in, flipping through Richard's chart. "Mr. Sterling, your heart attack was a warning. If you continue at the pace you're going, you won't make it another 5 years." Richard sighed, rubbing his temples. "And what am I supposed to do? Quit my job? Meditate on a mountain?" His voice carried its usual sarcasm, but for the first time there was also frustration. The doctor chuckled. "I'm not telling you to change who you are, but you might want to think about why you're doing all of this. What's the point of power if you don't have anyone to share it with?" The words lingered long after the doctor left. Richard Sterling had everything, yet when he had been at his weakest, there had been no family by his bedside, no friends waiting for him to wake up, just a janitor who had left without asking for anything in return. A few days later, Richard was well enough to walk around the hospital with assistance. He kept mostly to himself, but he observed things he had never bothered noticing before. He watched the way nurses greeted patients with warmth, how families sat together holding hands, how hospital staff worked tirelessly without expecting recognition, and then one afternoon he saw David. The janitor was down the hall, mopping near the waiting area, the same way he had at Richard's office. He worked with quiet efficiency, unnoticed by most. Richard found himself watching, remembering all the times he had walked past janitors in his building without a second thought. This time, he didn't walk past. Richard approached slowly, clearing his throat. David looked up, clearly surprised to see him. "You're up?" he said simply. Richard nodded, feeling oddly awkward. "Yeah." He hesitated before adding, "I wanted to see you." David arched a brow, leaning on his mop. "Why?" The billionaire let out a breath, glancing away. He wasn't sure how to say what he needed to. He had never thanked anyone properly in his life. Apologies and gratitude weren't things he gave easily. I've been thinking a lot, Richard admitted, about what happened, about why you helped me. David shrugged. Like I said, it was the right thing to do. Richard studied him. The janitor wasn't expecting praise. He wasn't expecting money. It unsettled Richard because, in his world, everything had a price. He had never understood people who did things without expecting something in return. You really don't want anything? Richard finally asked. David smirked. I didn't do it for a reward, Mr. Sterling. Richard shook his head in disbelief. That's hard for me to understand. David leaned on his mop, his expression unreadable. Maybe that's the problem. The words stung, but not because they were meant to. They stung because Richard knew they were true. That night, Richard lay awake in his hospital bed, staring at the ceiling. The world he had built was crumbling in his mind. The idea that success was measured only in money, that people only did things for selfish reasons. It didn't make sense anymore. For years, he had thought of kindness as weakness. He had believed power meant control, that caring too much would make him vulnerable. But now, lying in a hospital bed with no one but himself, he wondered if he had gotten it all wrong. He had. Survived a heart attack, but he wasn't sure he knew how to survive what came next. And for the first time in his life, Richard Sterling had no idea what to do. Richard Sterling had spent his life making decisions in seconds, snapping orders, closing deals, cutting people off without hesitation. But this was different. For the first time, he didn't know what the next move was. He had built an empire, yet here he was, grappling with something as simple as understanding a janitor's kindness. It wasn't that he couldn't change. It was that he didn't know how. The days passed, and Richard remained in the hospital, recovering physically, but still struggling mentally. He had always prided himself on being a man of logic, yet nothing about his current situation made sense. He had spent decades treating people like tools, and when he finally needed help, it came from someone he had overlooked his entire life. That thought alone kept him awake at night. The next morning, he forced himself to do something he had never done before. Listen. As he shuffled slowly through the hospital halls, he took the time to observe. He watched nurses laughing together despite their exhaustion, doctors working tirelessly, families sitting by their loved ones. These were people who didn't measure their worth in bank accounts or luxury cars. They measured it in moments. And then there was David. Every morning, like clockwork, the janitor moved through the halls with quiet determination, cleaning without complaint. It was a job no one noticed until it wasn't done. Richard had walked past men like David thousands of times, never once considering their existence beyond the tasks they performed. But now, he couldn't ignore it. He wouldn't ignore it. That afternoon, Richard did something that felt unnatural to him. He waited. He sat in the small cafeteria near the lobby, watching as David finished mopping the floors. The janitor didn't see him at first, too focused on his work. When he finally looked up and spotted Richard sitting there, an eyebrow quirked in curiosity. Richard gestured to the seat across from him. "Join me." David hesitated, gripping the mop handle. "I'm working," Richard smirked slightly. "So fire yourself for 10 minutes. A long silence followed. David glanced at the clock, then at the half-cleaned floor, before finally setting the mop against the wall and pulling out a chair. "This is new," he said, crossing his arms. Richard leaned back, folding his hands together. "I don't do this sort of thing often," David chuckled. "No kidding." For a moment, neither spoke. Richard, who had led board meetings with billionaires, found himself at a loss for words. The weight of something unspoken sat between them. Finally, he exhaled. "You're a good man," he admitted. "And I don't say that about many people." David shrugged. "It's not that hard to help someone." Richard scoffed, shaking his head. "For you, maybe. For people like me, it's different." David tilted his head. "Is it?" The billionaire hesitated. Was it? He had spent his whole life believing that kindness was a weakness, that wealth and power were what mattered. But now, sitting across from a man who had saved his life with nothing to gain, he wasn't so sure anymore. Richard sighed, rubbing his temple. I don't know how to do this. David furrowed his brow. Do what? Richard met his gaze. Change. For the first time, David saw something in the billionaire's eyes that hadn't been there before. Vulnerability. Change wasn't something that happened overnight. Richard knew that. He had built a billion-dollar empire, but he had no blueprint for rebuilding himself. So he started small. Over the next few days, he made a point to speak to the hospital staff, not just about his condition, but about them, their lives, their struggles. He learned that one of the nurses worked 2 jobs to support her son's education, that the security guard had once been an aspiring musician, that the doctor treating him had lost his own father to heart disease. Every story was a reminder of something Richard had forgotten, that people were more than just their job titles. One evening, as he walked through the hospital courtyard for fresh air, he found David sitting on a bench, taking a rare break. Without thinking, Richard sat beside him. David glanced over. Didn't take you for the type who enjoys hospital benches? Richard smirked. Didn't take you for the type who takes breaks? David chuckled. Fair enough. Silence stretched between them before Richard finally asked, Why are you a janitor? David didn't seem offended by the question. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Because it pays the bills, he said simply. I got a family to take care of. Wife, 2 kids. This job lets me put food on the table. Richard frowned. You ever think about doing something else? David exhaled, a thoughtful look in his eyes. Sure, but life doesn't always give you choices. Sometimes you do what you gotta do. Richard let that sink in. For all his wealth, he had never known what it was like to struggle just to survive. That night, Richard couldn't shake a thought that had lodged itself deep into his mind. He had always measured success in terms of profit, in numbers on a balance sheet. But what if he had been wrong? What if real success wasn't about what you had, but what you gave? For the first time in his life, Richard Sterling wasn't thinking about how to make his empire bigger. He was thinking about how to make it matter. The day of Richard Sterling's discharge arrived, but it felt different than he had expected. He had spent his life rushing from one place to another, treating time like currency, something to be spent only on things that would bring him more wealth. Yet now, as he sat on the edge of his hospital bed, tying the laces of his expensive leather shoes, he felt strangely unsteady, not physically. His doctors had cleared him, advising rest and lifestyle changes, but his body was healing. No, this unease was something deeper, a discomfort with the world he was about to return to. A nurse entered with a smile. You're all set, Mr. Sterling. Discharge papers are ready. He nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He glanced at his phone. Hundreds of emails, notifications, and missed calls from business partners who had no idea what had happened to him. He could already predict the conversations. We need to discuss the quarterly report. Investors are waiting. The market doesn't pause just because you're in the hospital. For the first time, he felt exhausted at the thought of it all. As he walked down the hall, heading toward the exit, he passed by the familiar janitor cart. The same one he had ignored 1,000 times before. And there was David, wiping down a window, humming quietly to himself. Richard hesitated. He could just leave. He didn't owe anyone anything. That was how he had always lived. But something inside him knew, if he left without saying anything, he would be proving that nothing had changed. So instead, he stopped. David looked over his shoulder, surprised. Didn't think I'd see you again? Richard smirked, though it lacked his usual arrogance. Guess I'm full of surprises. David set down his cloth and faced him. So what now? Back to the office? Back to being the man in the suit? Richard exhaled. I don't know, he admitted. It was the most honest thing he had said in years. David studied him for a moment, then nodded toward the hospital doors. The real world's out there, Sterling. Question is, how are you going to walk back into it? Richard had no answer. He had spent his life knowing exactly what came next, but now he wasn't so sure anymore. Outside, the city was just as he had left it, fast, loud, indifferent. Nothing had changed in the world, yet everything felt different to him. His driver stood by his car, ready to take him back to his penthouse, back to the life he had built for himself. He climbed into the back seat, but as the car pulled away from the hospital, his eyes drifted to the people on the street. He saw things he had never noticed before. The exhausted waitress wiping her forehead outside a diner, the construction worker eating a quick lunch on the curb, the elderly woman struggling to carry her groceries. People he had always been too busy to see. He leaned back in his seat, staring at the skyline. The city had always belonged to him, or at least that's what he had believed. But now, he realized, he had never really been a part of it. The car pulled up to his luxurious high-rise building, where the doorman greeted him with a polite nod. The lobby was pristine, every detail designed for extravagance. Yet, as Richard stepped inside, he felt a strange sense of detachment. His penthouse was exactly as he had left it, sleek, modern, expensive, a place of wealth but not warmth. He had spent years turning it into a fortress of success, yet standing there now, it felt empty. He poured himself a glass of water, staring out at the city skyline. Normally, he would have gone straight to his home office, jumped into meetings, sent out orders. But for the first time, he hesitated. His empire was waiting, but was it still what he wanted? Hours passed before he finally did something unexpected. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he had never thought he would. When David answered, he sounded surprised. "Didn't think you'd call." Richard exhaled, staring out at the city. "You asked me a question earlier," he said, "about how I was going to walk back into the world." David waited. Richard smirked slightly. "I think I need to figure that out." David chuckled. "Well, at least you're asking the right questions." For the first time in his life, Richard Sterling had no plan, and for the first time in his life, that didn't terrify him. The next morning, Richard sat at his desk in his penthouse, staring at the city skyline. The world was moving as it always had, fast, ruthless, uncaring. It was the world he had thrived in, the world he had built himself in. But now, as he sat in his expensive leather chair, everything felt different. Emails flooded his inbox. His company was waiting for him. The board had been patient during his hospital stay, but now they expected him back in control. Decisions needed to be made. Profits needed to be chased. He exhaled sharply and clicked open the latest financial report. But before he could read a single number, his phone buzzed. It was his assistant. "Sir, there's a situation at the company. You need to come in immediately." Richard frowned. "What kind of situation?" "It's about the layoffs." His stomach tightened. Layoffs? He hadn't approved any layoffs. "Send my car," he said, already standing up. An hour later, Richard walked into the glass doors of Sterling Enterprises. The moment he entered, whispers spread through the office like wildfire. Employees turned stealing glances at him, but there was something different in their expressions. It wasn't just the usual fear or respect. It was resentment. His assistant met him by the elevators, walking briskly beside him as they headed toward the boardroom. "The finance team proposed cost-cutting measures while you were gone," she explained. "They started layoffs in the lower departments, janitorial staff, maintenance teams, cafeteria workers." Richard's jaw clenched. Janitorial staff. Who authorized this? He asked sharply. The board signed off on it. It was the fastest way to cut costs. Richard's mind flashed back to the hospital, to David pushing a mop, humming to himself, to the quiet dignity of the people who kept buildings like this running. He knew these people now. They weren't just numbers, they were names. They were faces, and his company had tossed them aside like nothing. The boardroom was silent when he walked in. Executives sat around the long table, murmuring amongst themselves until they noticed him. A few of them stood, shaking his hand. Others just nodded. "Richard," one of them said, "glad to see you back." "Save it," Richard said coldly, taking his seat at the head of the table. "Someone tell me why we're firing the people who keep this company running." A man from finance cleared his throat. It was a logical move. The profit margins were shrinking, and payroll cuts were the simplest solution. Richard narrowed his eyes. Simplest for who? There was a long pause. No one answered. You think this company runs on executives sitting in glass offices? Richard continued. You think clients sign million-dollar deals because of the furniture in this room? Silence. This company runs because people make it run, Richard said. People who work late nights cleaning offices. People who fix broken elevators, who prepare food, who do jobs you don't even think about. The room remained still. Richard leaned forward. Reverse the layoffs. All of them. Effective immediately. The finance director frowned. Richard, we have projections to meet. The shareholders, screw the projections, Richard snapped. Find another way. Cut executive bonuses if you have to. But we are not throwing people away. The executives exchanged uneasy glances. They had never seen Richard like this before, but they knew better than to argue. By the afternoon, the emails had been sent. The layoffs were reversed. Every worker who had been fired was given their job back. Some didn't even know they had been laid off yet. They never would. Richard sat in his office, exhaling deeply. He should have felt victorious. He had saved dozens of jobs with a single decision, but something still felt unfinished. He reached for his phone. An hour later, Richard walked into the hospital, heading toward a familiar hallway. He found David, finishing up his shift, wiping down a nurse's station with practiced efficiency. David looked up, blinking in surprise. Didn't expect to see you again. Richard smirked slightly. I seem to be making a habit of showing up where you are. David chuckled, setting down his cloth. So, what's the occasion? Richard hesitated. The words weren't easy for him. Apologies and gratitude were foreign concepts in his world. But if he was going to change, he had to start somewhere. I fixed something today, Richard said. Something that should have never happened. David frowned slightly. What do you mean? Richard exhaled. My company was laying off janitors, maintenance workers, the people who do the jobs no one notices. David's expression darkened. Figures. Not anymore, Richard said. I stopped it. David studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. That's a good start, Richard smirked. It's not the end. David grinned. Well then, I guess we'll see what you do next. For the first time in his life, Richard Sterling didn't feel like he had something to prove. He just felt like a man, trying to do the right thing, and that was enough. A week had passed since Richard reversed the layoffs, but the decision still lingered in his mind. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about profit margins or shareholder approvals. Instead, he thought about the people whose lives had changed because of a single choice. His choice. But something about it still felt incomplete. One morning, as he sipped his coffee in his office, his mind drifted back to David, the janitor who had saved his life. The man who had unknowingly set his transformation in motion. Richard had spent his career rewarding executives for closing deals, for increasing revenue, for making him richer. But now, for the first time, he wanted to reward someone for doing something money couldn't buy, showing kindness. The idea formed in his mind, and this time he acted on it. That afternoon, Richard returned to the hospital, stepping into the same halls that had once felt like a prison. But today, he wasn't a patient. He was a man with a purpose. He found David where he always was, working unnoticed, quietly making the world cleaner. The janitor looked up, surprised to see him again. Okay, now you're just making a habit. Of visiting me, David said with a smirk, leaning on his mop. Richard chuckled. Yeah, well, I've got something to say. David raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. Richard took a breath. This was new territory for him. He wasn't negotiating a deal. He wasn't manipulating a boardroom. This was just honest. I want to offer you a job, Richard said. David's smirk faltered, replaced by a look of genuine surprise. A job, Richard nodded. A real one. At my company. Facility manager. Better pay. Better hours. No more night shifts. No more scrubbing floors. David blinked, clearly thrown off. Wait, you're serious? As serious as a heart attack, Richard said, then added with a smirk, and trust me, I know a thing or two about those. David let out a short laugh, but his eyes were studying Richard, searching for the catch. Why are you doing this? Richard exhaled. Because you deserve it. He looked David in the eye. You saved my life, but more than that, you made me see things differently. That's not something I can ignore. David was silent for a long moment. He glanced down at his mop, at the life he had always known. Then he met Richard's gaze again. I'm not a businessman, Sterling. Richard shrugged. Good. That means you won't turn into me. David chuckled, shaking his head. Then, with a thoughtful nod, he extended his hand. All right, I'll take it. Richard grasped his hand firmly. Welcome to the team, David. And for the first time in years, Richard Sterling felt like he had made a decision that actually mattered. Richard Sterling had spent his life believing that success was measured in numbers, the size of his bank account, the power of his company, the fear in his competitors' eyes. He had built walls so high around himself that no one could get in, not even the people who worked for him, the ones who made his empire possible. But in the end, it wasn't money, power, or influence that saved him. It was kindness. As he sat in his office watching the city skyline, Richard reflected on the past few weeks. The heart attack had nearly taken his life, but it had given him something far greater. A second chance. A chance to change, to be better, to see people for more than what they could offer him, and this time he wouldn't waste it. David's first day at Sterling Enterprises was unlike anything he had expected. He wasn't mopping floors anymore. He wasn't invisible. People actually greeted him, some with curiosity, others with surprise. A janitor promoted to facility manager. It was unheard of. But David didn't care about their opinions. He had earned this, and the most surprising part, Richard Sterling treated him like an equal. Gone was the ruthless CEO who once walked past janitors without a glance. In his place was a man who now understood the value of people, the ones who worked late, who cleaned the offices, who made the company function. Richard still had a long way to go. Change didn't happen overnight, but for the first time, he was on the right path. One evening, as David was leaving for the day, Richard walked beside him. The two men, once strangers, now something closer to friends, stood outside the towering skyscraper. You ever think about how crazy life is? David asked, looking up at the building. One day I'm cleaning the floors. The next, I'm working here. Richard smirked. One day I thought I had everything. The next I realized I had nothing. David nodded. Funny how things turn out. Richard took a deep breath, letting the cool night air fill his lungs. Yeah, he said, a rare smile tugging at his lips. Funny indeed. And as they walked away, Richard Sterling finally understood what true wealth really was. Not money, not power, not success, but the people who stood beside you when you had none of it. Thanks for listening to the story. If you've been through something similar, share your experience in the comments. Let's support each other. And if you haven't already, don't forget to like and subscribe. If you want to watch the story, the judge fainted when she saw the necklace the prisoner was wearing, the same one her daughter click on right. If you want to watch the story, how she was a waitress at a wedding, then stopped cold when she saw her husband as the groom, click on left.